History is filled with moments where logic collapses and numbers lose their meaning, moments when tiny nations face giants and somehow strike them down. These are the battles that echo through centuries, not because they were expected victories, but because they were impossible ones. And in the early 7th century, on a rugged corner of the Korean Peninsula, one of the greatest military upsets in human history unfolded. What happened there wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a collision between imperial arrogance and a people who understood their land, their strategy, and their enemy better than anyone imagined. It sounded absurd, almost laughable. 27,000 defenders standing in the path of an invading host said to number more than 300,000, the spear point of a larger campaign that would eventually push over 1 million men toward the Korean Peninsula. On parchment, the outcome seemed predetermined. Every instinct tells us the smaller army should collapse instantly. Yet in 612 AD, at the Battle of Salsu, that small force did the impossible. They didn't merely hold the line. They shattered the Sui invasion and turned a seemingly effortless conquest into one of the most humiliating disasters an empire ever suffered. The invaders were the Sui dynasty, marching south with confidence, discipline, and overwhelming numbers. Their legions were well supplied, richly equipped, and convinced that Goguryeo would crumble at the first push. What they were about to encounter, however, was a defender who knew every slope, river bend, and valley shadow, and who wielded timing, deception, and psychological warfare with a mastery the Sui never anticipated. So how did a force so small break an army so massive? What traps, terrain, and tactics allowed Goguryeo to transform a hopeless situation into a legendary rout? To understand that, we must step into the heart of the Second Goguryeo Sui War, the violent climax of a geopolitical rivalry simmering ever since China was reunified. When the Sui dynasty ended nearly 3 centuries of chaos in 589 AD, Emperor Yang inherited far more than a newly unified empire. He inherited an ideological burden. In Chinese thought, the restored state was not just a regional kingdom. It was meant to be the center of the civilized world, the heart of the Tianxia, the all-under-heaven order. And within that worldview, any neighbor acting as an equal, especially one as powerful and proud as Goguryeo, was not merely inconvenient. It was an open insult, a challenge to China's political legitimacy. Goguryeo, for its part, had no intention of bowing to anyone. Commanding the rugged lands of northern Korea and Manchuria, the kingdom ruled territory that was strategically priceless. Kings like Pyongyang made it clear they would speak to the Sui emperor as peers, not subordinates. And they backed their words with action. Goguryeo tested Sui defenses with sharp border raids, maneuvered diplomatically to complicate Sui ambitions, and strengthen ties with influential neighbors like the Eastern Turkic Khaganate. Its military system was perfectly built for asymmetric warfare, swift detachments, hit-and-run tactics, exploitation of rocky terrain, and relentless psychological pressure. Their mountain fortresses were arranged not to deliver quick victories, but to grind invading armies down with time, hunger, and exhaustion. And when they chose to strike back, they unleashed their most fearsome weapon, the Gamusa, elite heavy cavalry. These riders, fully armored, their horses plated in iron, were the armored fists of the 7th century. Their long lances were meant to smash through retreating, weakened enemies. Against a starving army struggling across a river, they were devastating. Goguryeo wasn't merely a military power either. Its capital, Pyongyang, was a flourishing trading hub and one of the most fortified command centers in East Asia, ringed by mountain defenses and shielded by unforgiving terrain. Anyone marching into that landscape was not just fighting soldiers, they were fighting the land itself. This was a lesson the Sui already endured during Emperor Wen's disastrous 598 campaign. He hurled around 300,000 men at Goguryeo, only to have the invasion collapse under mud-choked roads, impossible weather, and spreading disease. The mountain forts held firm. The remnants of the Sui army limped home drained and humiliated. That defeat changed everything. It showed that Goguryeo was one of the hardest targets in the ancient world. Any future assault would require not just a larger force, but something unprecedented in scale. And Emperor Yang, ambitious, proud, and desperate to carve his name into history, took the lesson to heart. He wouldn't gather a big army. He would raise the largest army humanity had ever seen. His preparations were staggering. At the center of it all was the Grand Canal, a colossal engineering achievement linking North and South China with a single artery of water. Grain, weapons, laborers, and soldiers now flowed with unmatched speed. Once the canal opened, the empire began one of the greatest mobilizations ever recorded. According to the Book of Sui, more than 1,133,800 combat troops were summoned, supported by an additional 2 million workers, engineers, porters, clerks, cooks, and boatmen. Even if the numbers were exaggerated by later chroniclers, the scale was without precedent. To grasp it fully, it took 40 days for the entire army column to finish departing. The marching line stretched roughly 300 kilometers, the distance from New York City to Baltimore. If you watched from a hilltop, you could stand for hours and still see soldiers moving endlessly across the horizon. This was not merely a war. It was a declaration to his own people and to all watching powers that the Sui Emperor could unleash overwhelming force at will. Nothing short of a continent-wide avalanche could send such a message. To avoid repeating the fiasco of 598, the Sui redesigned their strategy. On paper, it was sound. The main army would pin down Goguryeo renowned frontier fortresses, places like Yodong, which had a reputation for holding out against anything short of a miracle. Meanwhile, a specially selected spearhead of 305,000 troops, led by commanders like Yuan Shu and Yu Zhongwen, would slip past the defensive line and march straight for Pyongyang. If all went smoothly, Goguryeo's border forces would be trapped in their fortresses while the giant vanguard drove directly into the heart of the kingdom. But that phrase, if all went smoothly, was where everything unraveled. At the core of the Sui military machine was a fatal flaw: Emperor Yang's obsessive centralization of authority. He mistrusted his generals and refused to let significant actions occur without his personal approval. He reportedly ordered that any major maneuver, any truly exciting event, must wait for imperial permission. And on the front lines, this absurd policy turned a massive army into a paralyzed giant. One famous incident reveals how far it went. When Yodong's defenders appeared ready to surrender, an enormous breakthrough, the Sui general in command was forced to halt operations and dispatch a messenger all the way back to Chang'an to request the emperor's blessing. The moment slipped away, and the war marched toward catastrophe. Weeks slipped away, lost not to battle, but to hesitation. And in those long, suffocating pauses forced by imperial bureaucracy, Goguryeo's defenders recovered, reinforced, and fortified every inch of their line. By the time summer heat settled over the frontier, the massive Sui main army, with all its power, prestige, and manpower, had failed to capture even a single border fortress. Supplies dwindled, morale thinned, and far ahead of them, the deep penetration vanguard marched farther into danger with every passing day. That vanguard strategy, impressive on paper, rested on just two fragile supports. First, the physical endurance of the 305,000-man strike force. Second, a constant stream of provisions that the Sui Navy was supposed to deliver along the coast. But both pillars began cracking almost from the moment the invasion started. The planners in Chang'an imagined that the vanguard could haul enough tools, grain, and equipment to sustain the long march toward Pyongyang. But such optimism dissolved the moment boots hit the rugged terrain. Hills, rivers, and choking forests slowed progress to a crawl. Men staggered with exhaustion. Horses collapsed in the mud. And soon the predictable happened. The soldiers began discarding gear. Heavy equipment went first, then tools, and eventually, in the worst stretches, even precious food was tossed aside simply because it weighed too much. With every mile, the vanguard grew lighter, yet weaker, hungrier, and more vulnerable. If there was one thing that might have saved them, it was the fleet. The entire mission depended on Commander Lee Huer's navy meeting them along the Taedong River with desperately needed supplies. The fleet wasn't support, it was the army's heartbeat. Without it, no force that size could hope to survive far beyond Liaodong. Then Goguryeo struck. A sudden ambush smashed Lee Huer's fleet. Ships were seized or burned, the river routes severed, and in an instant, the vanguard's entire logistical spine snapped. In an age when a single soldier needed several pounds of grain per day, the realization hit like a hammer. Nothing they were depending on was coming. The math alone was terrifying. Yet despite the disaster unfolding on land and sea, the expectations from the imperial court did not shift. Victory was still mandatory. Emperor Yang demanded triumph, quickly, and so commanders Yuan Shu and Yu Zhongwen pressed on, driving their enormous but starving column ever deeper, knowing they were passing the point where any hope of resupply existed. What began as an elite strike force had now transformed into something far more desperate. An army gambling its survival on reaching Pyongyang before exhaustion finished what Goguryeo had started. And this brings us to the moment where everything converged, the Battle of Salsu. The Salsu River, known today as the Changchon, winds toward the Yellow Sea. On a map, it appears ordinary, but in 612 AD, it was the final natural barrier between the Sui vanguard and their prize, Pyongyang. Barely 12 kilometers from the capital, it tempted the Sui forward, and at the same time offered Goguryeo the perfect killing ground. The river had to be crossed going in and going out, and the crossing points were few. General Eulji Mundok understood exactly what that meant, so he turned the river into a trap. He didn't meet the Sui in a glorious, head-on clash. Instead, he fought and deliberately lost 7 skirmishes. Each retreat was controlled, measured, and intentional, luring the Sui deeper, pushing them farther from their supply lines, and bleeding them slowly. Every minor victory the Sui celebrated only thickened the noose tightening around their necks. By the time the 305,000-man vanguard staggered to the outskirts of Pyongyang, the signs of collapse were unmistakable. The proud soldiers who had marched confidently through Liaodong and now appeared ghost-like, hollow-cheeked, dehydrated, stumbling from hunger. The chronicles described them simply, starved and exhausted. An army that size cannot function on empty wagons. A siege was impossible. Even a conventional field battle would have been nearly suicidal. Their last hope was the fantasy that Pyongyang might fall quickly enough to save them. But when Yuan Shu and Yu Zhongwen finally looked upon the city, they understood their nightmare fully. Pyongyang was not merely fortified, it was a fortress labyrinth, stocked with fresh defenders who had been waiting patiently for this moment. It was then that General Eulji Mundok delivered the final psychological blow. He sent Yu Zhongwen a short, graceful poem praising the general's supposed brilliance and heaven-favored strategy. The flattery was so exaggerated it bordered on mockery. Then came the bait. If the Sui had already won so many victories, Mundok asked, why not be satisfied and return home? Yu Zhongwen did not recognize the trap. Immediately afterward, Mundok dispatched something even more irresistible, a formal offer of surrender, but only if the Sui army withdrew at once. For commanders desperate for an excuse, this seemed like salvation. They couldn't take Pyongyang. Their men were collapsing. Supplies were gone. And Emperor Yang, far away in Chang'an, still demanded victory with no flexibility. So the fake surrender became their lifeline. Retreat orders were issued. To shield themselves from ambush, the Sui attempted to organize into a defensive square formation, the Fong. Under normal conditions, it was an effective tactic. But this was no fresh army. These were exhausted men who had marched hundreds of kilometers through heat, disease, and terror. They now had to cover 180 miles of hostile terrain while somehow maintaining formation. Then came the river. The Salsu was no gentle ford. It was a bottleneck, narrow, swift, and merciless. Crossing forced the Sui into a stretched, exposed line. Their square formation dissolved into chaos. Their massive numbers, once their strength, became a trap. On the opposite bank, Goguryeo forces lay hidden, poised for the decisive strike. This was not a battle. It was a calculated annihilation. Mundok waited until roughly half the Sui army was mid-crossing, split by the river into two helpless halves, one struggling in the water and on the far bank, the other stranded behind them and unable to move forward. That was the moment he unleashed hell. Goguryeo's forces surged from concealment with terrifying precision, arrows raining down, cavalry charging into the disorganized masses, ambush units striking exactly when cohesion was at its weakest. The enormous Sui army, trapped by its own size, could not maneuver, could not reinforce, could not escape. The river they had crossed became the river that drowned them. For generations, many later storytellers, especially nationalist historians, claimed that Eulji Mundok broke the Sui army at Salsu by releasing a massive dam and drowning the invaders in a man-made flood. It's a dramatic image, and one that has captured imaginations, but the records written closest to the time tell a different story. There is no mention of dams, reservoirs, or engineered deluges. What mattered was far simpler and far more brilliant. Mundok understood that the river itself could do the work for him. He didn't need an artificial flood. The Salsu's shifting depth, uneven bed, and sharp currents were enough. The crossing naturally disrupted the Sui formations. Heavy armored cavalry became clumsy in the water. Infantry, already exhausted from weeks of starvation and forced marches, struggled to stay upright. The river turned into a perfectly timed weapon, a natural blade aimed straight at the weakest point of an already sinking army. And then came the final blow. Goguryeo's forces struck with precision, targeting officers and commanders first. Right General Xiong was killed almost immediately, severing leadership in the rear ranks. Once the command chain snapped, confusion swept through the ranks like a storm. Orders went unheard, formations unraveled, and what had once been a disciplined column of 305,000 men began to disintegrate under pressure. Panic fed on itself. The survivors fled westward in a frantic attempt to reach the Yalu River, about 180 kilometers away, in a single desperate day and night. That distance alone tells the story. This was no tactical withdrawal. It was a terrified stampede, a scattered mass of starving men running for their lives across hostile ground, hunted relentlessly by Goguryeo's mobile units. Every weakness the Sui had carried into the campaign, crushed supply lines, dehydrated troops, rigid command, and the deadly bottleneck of the river, combined into a single catastrophic collapse under Mundok's direction. The result was a rout so complete it scarcely seems real. Of the 305,000 elite soldiers who crossed the Liao River in the advance toward Pyongyang, only about 2,700 staggered back to the main Sui base at Liaodong Fortress. Some sources offer a slightly higher figure, around 7,700, but any version of the number still means that more than 300,000 men vanished. A casualty rate above 99%. Almost no other battle in the classical world compares to the scale of this destruction. And yet, it wasn't the sword that killed them. It was exhaustion, terrain, hunger, chaos, and a commander who understood how to weaponize all three. Strategically, the annihilation of the vanguard erased the purpose of the entire 612 campaign. The main Sui army, still stuck facing impregnable frontier fortresses, could do nothing to rescue the shattered column. They had no choice but to retreat. Goguryeo had solved its greatest strategic threat with a single, perfectly executed trap. The Sui dynasty's most intimidating strength, its overwhelming numbers, had become the very thing that doomed it. For Emperor Yang, the consequences were immediate and devastating. His prestige collapsed. The loss of so many elite troops, combined with the utter failure to achieve even one major objective, drained the state's resources and shattered public confidence. The campaigns of 613 and 614 sputtered out amid rebellion, draft dodging, and internal unrest. The empire was bleeding from every direction. Salsu wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment the Sui dynasty began to die. The disaster pushed the imperial system past its limit. For massive invasions had already emptied the treasury, but Salsu broke more than the budget. It broke the nation's backbone. Hundreds of thousands of sons, fathers, and brothers never returned. Entire communities felt the loss of men dragged into endless campaigns. To rebuild its armies, the state tightened taxes and conscription even further. Villages resisted. Uprisings ignited. Stability buckled. Salsu was the spark on the powder keg. 6 years later, in 618 CE, the Sui dynasty collapsed and the Tang dynasty rose in its place. But Salsu's legacy reached far beyond China. Across the Korean Peninsula, Goguryeo's triumph established a new reality. When the Tang dynasty under Emperor Gaozu contemplated war, they approached Goguryeo with caution. Unlike the Sui, the Tang opened with diplomacy, testing alliances, forging peace terms, and preparing slowly. Salsu had taught the world a hard lesson. Numbers alone cannot conquer Goguryeo. The battle became a classic example of asymmetric warfare. Eulji Mundok's forces were small, but possessed advantages the Sui could never match. Unparalleled intelligence, mastery off terrain, flexible command structures, and deadly mobile units like the Gamusa cavalry. Against such adaptability, the Sui's rigid hierarchy and dependence on unbroken supply lines became fatal liabilities. For students of military history, Salsu stands as a masterclass in strategic thinking. It wasn't decided by heroic duels or massive siege engines. It was decided by logistics, timing, deception, and the merciless precision with which Mundok manipulated an enemy already stretched to its limit. He didn't need to destroy all 305,000 men in direct battle. He simply had to let their own exhaustion finish the work. Salsu overturns the common belief that sheer numbers win wars. It proves that operational reach, flexible command, and intelligent use of terrain can dismantle even the largest army on Earth. It also remains a warning. Any military system built on centralized authority, slow decision-making, and rigid formations can crumble when facing a nimble, adaptive opponent who shapes the battlefield to his advantage. The largest army in the world can still be broken. It can still be routed. It can still be erased. Salsu endures as a monument to strategy over strength, intelligence over brute force, and preparation over pride, a lesson that still echoes in military doctrine today.